the secret they buried for 1,600 years? What if everything we thought we knew was wrong? What if the most feared warriors in ancient Europe were never who we believed they were? And what if their true origin was hidden, not by accident, but by design? For generations, one story stood unchallenged. The Huns came from the east, from the endless grasslands of Central Asia nomads, horsemen. Warriors born to conquer. It sounded logical, it felt complete. And so it became history. But history is not always truth. Sometimes it is a story that survived, and sometimes the real story disappears. Somewhere around the 4th century, something changed. A sudden movement. A force appeared on the edges of Europe. No warning, no clear beginning, just fear. Villages fell silent, cities prepared for war. Empires began to shake. They came fast, too fast, riding across the land with a speed no army could match. And with them came destruction. This was the moment the Huns entered history. But even then, something felt different. Roman writers struggled to describe them. They weren't just enemies. They were unfamiliar, strange in appearance, strange in behavior. Their language was unknown. Their customs were unclear. It was as if they came from a place beyond the known world. So the Romans did what people always do when faced with the unknown. They created an answer. The Huns must have come from the east, from lands beyond the horizon, from Central Asia. It was a convenient explanation. It placed the Huns into a pattern. Other steppe warriors had come before the Scythians, the Sarmatians, nomadic groups moving west. So the Huns were placed into the same category. The story made sense. And once a story makes sense, people stop questioning it. For centuries, no one looked deeper. But cracks were always there, heat in the details. Archaeologists began uncovering graves, weapons buried with warriors, jewelry placed beside the dead, bones preserved beneath the earth. Each discovery added a piece to the puzzle, but the pieces didn't always match. Some artifacts looked Eastern, Sibyl, functional, nomadic, but others felt different, more refined, more European. Burial styles varied. Some followed steppe traditions, others did not. It was inconsistent, confusing, and difficult to explain. Historians noticed, but they didn't change the story. Because the larger narrative still held, the Huns came from Central Asia. That was the answer, even if the details didn't fit perfectly, and so the mystery remained buried beneath assumptions. Then something new entered the field, a tool that didn't rely on written accounts, a tool that didn't depend on interpretation, a tool that looked directly into the past, DNA, ancient DNA. For the first time, scientists could examine the genetic code of people who lived thousands of years ago. They could trace ancestry, track movement, reveal origins, without bias, without guesswork. And when this technology reached the study of the Huns, everything changed. Researchers began collecting samples from burial sites across Europe, remains believed to belong to the Hunnic period. Carefully selected, carefully tested, the goal was simple: confirm the story, prove that the Huns came from Central Asia. But the results didn't follow the script. At first, the differences were subtle. A few unexpected markers, a few unusual patterns, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise questions. So they tested more samples, expanded the research, compared results across regions. And slowly, a new picture began to form. It was not what they expected. Instead of a clear genetic identity, they found diversity, a mixture. Some individuals showed ancestry linked to Eastern regions. That part fit, but many others did not. They showed strong European ancestry, deep roots in regions the Huns were supposed to invade. This was a problem because it challenged the core assumption. If the Huns were invaders from Central Asia, why did so many of them appear genetically European? The more data they collected, the harder it became to ignore. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern. A consistent pattern. The Huns were not genetically uniform. They were mixed. Highly mixed. And that meant something important. The Huns were not a single group moving into Europe. They were something else entirely. But what? This is where the story becomes more complicated and more interesting, because history rarely deals in simple answers. Researchers began comparing Hunnic DNA with earlier populations, looking for connections, trying to trace a path. Some links did appear, faint connections to groups in Central Asia, possibly related to earlier nomadic confederations, groups that once dominated the eastern steppe, but these connections were not strong, not dominant. They were small pieces in a much larger puzzle. And that raised a deeper question. If the Huns were only partially connected to Central Asia, then where did the rest come from? The answer seemed to be Europe, local populations. People who had lived in these regions for generations, people who suddenly became part of something new, something larger, something powerful. It suggested a different kind of origin, not a migration, but a formation, a blending of cultures, a merging of identities. But why would history miss this? Why would ancient writers describe the Huns as outsiders, if many of them were not? The answer lies in perception. To the Romans, the Huns were different. Their lifestyle, their warfare, their leadership, everything about them felt foreign. Even if some of them shared the same land, or even ancestry, difference was enough, and once labeled as other, that identity remained, passed down through texts, through generations, until it became fact. But then, another discovery added a new layer to the mystery. Some elite burials, graves believed to belong to high-ranking Hunnic individuals. These were different, more elaborate, more carefully preserved. And when scientists analyzed their DNA, they expected to find strong Central Asian ancestry, because leadership often preserves origins, but the results were surprising. In some cases, the Eastern connection was present, but in others, it was minimal, even absent. Instead, these individuals showed mixed ancestry, complex backgrounds, connections to multiple regions. This suggested something critical. Hunnic leadership was not based on origin, it was based on power, on influence, on the ability to unite different groups. This wasn't a simple invasion. It was a transformation, a new identity forming in real time. But then, something even more unexpected appeared. One particular set of remains, better preserved, more complete, possibly connected to the inner circle of Hunnic power. When scientists examined this DNA, they found something that didn't just challenge the theory, it shattered it. There was almost no trace of Central Asian ancestry, almost none. Instead, the genetic markers pointed elsewhere, toward Europe, toward populations already living in the region. This changed everything. Because if someone so closely connected to the Huns, someone possibly part of their elite, had no significant Eastern ancestry, then the foundation of the old theory collapsed. The Huns were not what history claimed, not even close, and that leads to a dangerous idea. What if the Huns were not invaders at all? What if they were a movement, a reorganization of existing populations, a new identity built from chaos? This would explain everything: the mixed DNA, the conflicting artifacts, the unclear origins. But it also raises a deeper question. Why did the story become so simple? Why did history reduce something complex into something easy to understand? The answer may lie in fear, because the Huns were terrifying. To the Romans, they represented chaos, a force that couldn't be controlled, and labeling them as outsiders made them easier to define, easier to oppose, easier to fear. But reality is rarely that simple. And now, after 600 years, the truth is starting to surface, slowly, piece by piece, and just when it seemed like the mystery was finally coming together, a final discovery changed everything again. A pattern hidden within the DNA itself, a connection that no one expected, because when scientists mapped the genetic data, they noticed something strange. Certain markers appeared in places they shouldn't. Not just in Hunnic remains, but in populations across Europe, Both before and after their time, it was as if the Huns were not just a group, but a bridge. A moment in history where different peoples merged and moved forward together. And if that is true, then the Huns did not disappear, they became something else. Something that continued long after their name faded, which means the real story is not about where they came from. It's about what they became. The secret beneath the bones of the story we trusted is no longer stable. The Huns were not what we thought, not a single tribe, not a simple invasion, not a clear line from Central Asia into Europe. Something else was happening, something far more complex, and now we begin again. DNA didn't match the story, artifacts didn't align, even elite burials raised questions. The Huns were not one people. They were many, but that only deepened the mystery, because if they were not defined by origin, then what held them together? What made them the Huns? This is where the story changes. Researchers began to shift their approach. Instead of asking, where did they come from? They asked something different. How did they form? And that question opened a new path. Because history is not just about movement, it's about identity. And identity can be created, it can be built even in chaos. Across the lands of Eastern Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries, the world was unstable, empires weakened, borders shifted, communities broke apart. The Roman Empire, once dominant, was losing control. Pressure built from all sides, and in that pressure, people moved not as armies, but as families, as tribes, as survivors, different groups, searching for security, matching for power. And in this unstable world, something began to form, a network, loose at first, then stronger, groups coming together, not because they shared ancestry, but because they shared a purpose, protection, opportunity, survival. This is how the Huns began to make sense, not as invaders, but as organizers, as leaders of a new kind of system, a confederation, flexible, adaptive, powerful. This explains their speed, their unpredictability, their ability to appear suddenly and disappear just as fast. They were not bound by one homeland because their strength was not land, it was people. And people can move, but then another layer of the mystery revealed itself. When scientists looked deeper into the DNA, they noticed something important. The Eastern genetic traces, while present, were concentrated not everywhere, but in specific individuals, often in higher status burials. This was a critical clue, because it suggested something about leadership. A small group, possibly with Eastern origins, may have played a key role in forming this identity, not as the entire population, but as a core, a catalyst. This idea connects to earlier steppe empires, like the ancient nomadic confederations that once ruled vast territories in Asia. These groups were known for something unique. They didn't rely on shared ancestry alone. They built alliances, they absorbed other groups, they created new identities from diversity. And if even a small number of individuals from that tradition moved west, they could have brought that system with them, not as conquerors alone, but as organizers, as leaders of transformation. This explains the mixed DNA, the blend of cultures, the sudden rise of a powerful, unified force. It wasn't just migration, it was a method, a strategy. But then something even more revealing emerged. A pattern in the timeline. When researchers dated the genetic samples, they noticed that the diversity increased over time. Earlier individuals showed more Eastern connections. Later individuals showed more European ancestry. This suggests a process, not a single event, but a transformation unfolding over decades, perhaps even generations. At first, a small group arrives. They connect with local populations. They form alliances. They build power. And over time, the identity spreads, expands, changes, until the original origin becomes almost invisible, hidden beneath layers of integration. And that brings us to one of the most important figures in this story, a name that echoes through history, a name that symbolizes the Huns, Attila. Known as one of the most feared leaders of the ancient world to the Romans, he was a threat unlike any other, a force that could not be controlled. But what if even Attila was not what we assume? His identity, his ancestry, his background, all filtered through ancient accounts. Accounts written by those who feared him, accounts that may not tell the full truth. Because when we look at the system he led, it doesn't reflect a single tribe. It reflects a coalition, a network of different peoples, united under one command, and that kind of system requires something specific. Not shared blood, but shared loyalty. This changes how we see power in the ancient world. It wasn't always about where you came from. It was about who you could bring together. And the Huns mastered this. But then, the story takes another turn, because as quickly as the Huns rose, they faded. After Attila's death, the structure weakened, the alliances broke, the identity dissolved. And just like that, the Huns seemed to disappear, but did they? This is where the DNA tells a different story, because the genetic traces don't vanish. They continue. They appear in later populations. In regions across Europe, subtle, scattered, but present, this suggests something powerful. The Huns did not vanish. They blended. They became part of the populations they once led. Their identity faded, but their legacy remained. And this brings us to the emotional core of the story, because for centuries, the Huns were seen as outsiders, invaders, strangers, but the truth is far more complex. They were part of the same human story, a story of movement, of adaptation, of survival. They were not just them, they were us. And that realization changes everything, because it challenges how we think about history, about identity, about the lines we draw between people. The Huns were not a distant mystery. They were a moment in time. They were a moment in time when boundaries broke, when different worlds collided and became one. And perhaps that is why their true origin remained hidden, because it doesn't fit a simple narrative. It doesn't fit into clear categories. It forces us to accept something uncomfortable. That identity is not fixed. It evolves, and sometimes it is created in the chaos of change. So what really happened 1,600 years ago? Did a group from the East conquer Europe, or did a new identity emerge from a world in motion? The answer is not simple. It is layered, complex, still unfolding. But one thing is certain. The old story is no longer enough, and the Huns are no longer just a name in history. They are a reminder that the past is not as clear as we think. That truth can be hidden in plain sight. And that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not about what we don't know, but about what we were taught to believe. So the next time you hear the name Huns, ask yourself, were they invaders from a distant land, or were they something far more unexpected? A living example,